Church, this morning I want us to imagine two very average imaginary families at Christmas time. On one hand, we have a family that is just unashamedly into the consumeristic side of Christmas. They just love it. And they don't do anything to engage during this time with their broader community. They don't use the Christmas time to practice generosity. They do exactly zero other things for other people. They just tell each other all the things that they want, and they go and order it from Amazon for each other and have Amazon gift wrap it for an additional $5 because that's totally worth it. And they just consume. And then on Christmas morning, they all parcel out their presents and somebody says, okay, go. And in 2 minutes, they're all gone. And maybe somebody makes eye contact with somebody else and says, thanks, and then rips into the other one. And after a very brief time, you kind of step back and look at all the Amazon gift wrapping, and it's like, it's over. Ouch. On the other hand, there's an imaginary family who just understands the reason for the season. And they're like, maybe we don't get anything for each other this year because we can sponsor more children in developing countries that way. And in fact, we're going to not get each other anything for Christmas because we want to use that money that we have left over from sponsoring all those children to fly in our extended family so that they can stay with us at Christmas. Both sides at the same time. It's going to be great. And they do all of the civic things. They get to know their neighbors. They go caroling together as a family. And then Christmas is over, and they take their in-laws to the airport, and it's sad. Because either way, there's a little bit of sadness in everything we do. There is a certain amount of suffering in every choice we make. The point is to choose the right things to suffer for. Peter has been writing, for us, he's been writing this letter for a while. We're almost done. Peter takes a long time to write this letter. This is not like firing off an email. Peter's probably done a first, second, and third draft. He has heard about the situation in the churches in Asia Minor, and he is writing a letter for those newly baptized Christians, and now towards the end of the letter, he's also turning towards the rest of the family of God. And he's writing letters about what it is going to mean for them to engage in a world that will reject them, guarantee it. And it seems like in the course of writing this letter that takes a long time, something has changed. Peter doesn't just write a first, second, third draft. Peter's got to train somebody to go take the letter. And he's got to find somebody who has a really specific skill set that is pretty uncommon. They can read. He's going to teach this person not only how to read the letter to these 5 different churches in Asia Minor, but to read it in such a way so that the message comes through. Peter's got to train the person in the theology of the letter. They've got to wait until another group is going to these different places because you can't travel alone. It's too dangerous. And so this letter takes a long time to form. It takes a long time to write. It takes a long time to prepare for. It's expensive. And it seems like something in these months of letter writing has changed. The situation was already not good for these young churches in Asia Minor, but it seems like it's gotten worse. Peter now describes their situation as a fiery ordeal. He knows that they are a persecuted people. They are a people who are already suffering for the choice of following Jesus. But now, what has become ostracization, what was bad blood between family members has become a fiery ordeal. And Peter says, don't be surprised. There is going to be something about the truth of you, there is going to be something about the truth of the world that will be revealed in this fiery ordeal. We don't know what it is. It's going to be painful. But don't be surprised and get ready for it, because something important is going to be revealed. Last week we talked about this really important New Testament word that is often translated as the end. It's telos. And last week we talked about it being kind of not just the end, the finality of something, but the goal, right? Because those two things mean the same things. We're moving towards the end, the desired end, God's desired end. Peter, last week in the reading says, the end of all things is near. It might mean the end of God's purposes is getting close to you. And now this fiery ordeal, Peter says when the end comes, when the end gets here, when the revealing of God's purposes are here, it's going to be like the pulling back of a curtain. The image is of a crowded theater. We're excited. We've dressed up to get on to a Broadway show, and we know an important story is about to be told just on the other side of those curtains. And when the end comes, it is like those curtains are pulled back, and we see the set, and the story begins, and the actors start telling a compelling story. And we knew it was there all along, but when the curtain is pulled back, there is a great revealing of a story we could not have known about before. We've only suspected its importance. This is what the coming end is going to be like. There is another important biblical word for this unveiling, this end. It's called at different times a revelation or an apocalypse. We have incorrectly understood the word apocalypse to mean a terrible, violent ending to all of God's creation. That's not what it means. It means a pulling back of the curtain, a pulling back of the thing that keeps us from seeing what is really real. This world just feels like staring at a curtain the whole time. And the world tells us that that's the way it is. That's the way it's always going to be. But Peter, God, through Peter, is telling us, no. There is a deeper reality on the other side. And when the end comes, there will be an unveiling, an apocalypse. And it will happen suddenly. And then, Peter says, what we will see is that people suffer for all sorts of things. But when the end comes, this fiery ordeal happens, those who are suffering with Jesus will be revealed to be in glory with Jesus all along. Peter talks about suffering a lot in this letter. I don't know if you've noticed that. The word suffering is used 16 different times in these 5 chapters. It's used 4 times in this short message. And you could be forgiven for thinking that Peter thinks that suffering is the point. But that's not quite it. Peter, at different times in the letter, says, no, it's not suffering that the point is. Otherwise, suffering for no good reason would be good. Otherwise, suffering for bad things would be good. If suffering was the virtue, there would be no bad reason to suffer. But Peter at different times says, no. Don't go out of your way to suffer. Don't suffer for meaningless things. Don't suffer for evil things. But when the end comes, be found suffering with Jesus. I don't like suffering. There's built-in neurological pathways that when my hand accidentally touches a hot stove says, no, stop that right now. And I think sometimes we've got this message that Jesus came to suffer so that we wouldn't have to. Jesus came and suffered so that I don't have to. But that is never the message. there is suffering in everything. And when this great unveiling happens, I'm going to do one more biblical word that's really important. One more biblical word. When this suffering happens, when this unveiling happens, and we are seen to be suffering with Jesus, we hope. The word for that undeniable truth of seeing reality for the first time, that's called judgment. Jesus is the bringer of judgment. When Jesus comes back and reveals all things, the undeniable, indisputable truth of when and where people are spending their suffering will be judgment. And Peter says, the household of God gets judged first. And what I want us to start shifting our minds to think about is that that's a good thing. That the people of God, the household of God, longs for Jesus' return. That we wait and look to the skies for Jesus to come back, praying that he comes and judges us and finds us suffering for the right things. Once I heard a message from a preacher's wife about suffering that changed the way I look at the world. She, her second child was born with severe mental and physical disabilities and died at around the age of 10. Lived a really difficult 10 years and then passed away. And as she's grieving, she tells the story, she's grieving a friend who was up to that point extremely helpful to just come and sit with her in her pain, asked what she intended to be a very helpful question. She said, "This pain you're experiencing, it is so deep. Do you think you will ever get over it?" And what she said next changed the way I look at everything. She said, "No, I'm never going to get over this. I'm never going to get over the pain of being her mom. I'm never going to get over the pain of her death. I don't want to. If I were to get over the pain of that experience, it would be as if that experience never happened at all. And that pain and that joy that is with me is proof that in some ways she's still here. That God blessed me with that pain. And to forget it would be to forget all of the blessings that came with that suffering." That rocked me. I don't like pain. I don't like suffering. I have this internal message that if I am hurting, if I am suffering, I must be doing something wrong and I should fix it right away. And so for her to say, "No, I'm going to live with this, and I hope I never forget it," well, that just changed the way I look at what it means to follow Jesus. There's a little bit of pain in every experience. The point is to live a life where we choose to suffer for the right things. Another story about suffering. I was born about a little under 2 years after the explosion in my home state of Mount St. Helens. And even though I was not alive when it happened, to grow up in Washington State, in Western Washington State, in the 80s and 90s is to still live in the shadow of the explosion of Mount St. Helens. This was a disaster, a devastation on a scale that's difficult to over-explain. It was equal to 24 megatons of TNT, or about 1,600 times larger explosion than the atomic bombs dropped at the end of World War II. 57 people lost their lives to the eruption, but that was just because it happened in a very uncrowded place at a very unpopular time for travel. The smoke plume entered the stratosphere. It was so high, so much so that ash from Mount St. Helens fell on every continent of the world. And the parts of the explosion that did not enter the stratosphere settled as far as Chicago, Illinois. My grandparents lived in eastern Washington, and there are pictures of them shoveling ash out of their driveway, like about 3 feet of snow. the explosion immediately leveled 9.4 million cubic meters of forests. If you've seen pictures of this devastation, you've seen how in an instant, 9.4 million cubic meters of forest and trees are now immediately laying down in the same place, like rows and rows of graves. And the economic impact on that for the state of Washington is just difficult to estimate. And it was so massive, so far-reaching, that the Forest Service decided it's not financially viable for us to start cutting up these trees. There's too many. It's too deep. It's too difficult to get to. And so the solution was to do nothing. And for decades, these forests just lay in the same direction. And then something magical happened. You might be able to guess what would happen to the soil underneath these trees after decades of trees decomposing. And it didn't happen right away. At least it wasn't visible right away. But all of this decomposing trees made the soil underneath it extremely rich and good for growth. And at first, there's no visible way to tell what was happening underneath, but before long, out of the black and gray ashes of destroyed forests start popping colors, purples, greens, pinks, creams, violets. And then the next year, they grew back even more verdant and even more beautiful. Life was breaking out of death. Life was growing beyond death, and it was undeniable. Even then, as these Indian paintbrushes and these mountain hemlocks start growing up out of the soil, there is still suffering beneath the soil of those flowers and plants. As the beautiful buds blossom and life returns to the forests, they are struggling just beneath the surface as their roots find life. They're struggling. They're suffering. Somewhere along the way, we got the message that God sent Jesus to end suffering. But God didn't even spare Jesus from suffering. If God would not even spare his own son from suffering, why would we think that the avoidance of suffering would be the point? If the point is to live like Jesus. If Jesus would say to us, you cannot be my follower without picking up your cross and following me every day, why would we think that the goal of this Jesus life would be to avoid suffering? The point is just to suffer for the right things. When the flowers begin blooming, when life flows up out of death, and all of a sudden in 1 year it is undeniable, where before we would have been crazy to think that something was growing there. That has a name. It is called an apocalypse. And the truth, the undeniable truth that life is apocalyptically springing up out of death, that's judgment. And God says through Peter that the household of God will be judged first, and that means that there might be life growing up here. That when the family of God, the household of God, chooses to not avoid suffer, but to move towards suffering for the right reasons, for the right things, that we will be revealed to be in God's glory. Of course we're going to suffer. Of course, Peter's churches are going to suffer. In a world that corrupt, in a world with no values and no good things that they're moving for, of course, living a life for Jesus is going to have some negative reactions. Of course, people are going to choose to oppose them. And at this time, it seems like they're even getting ready to kick the Christians out of their cities. Of course, following Jesus is going to lead to suffering. Because there is suffering in everything we do. We have to choose to suffer with Jesus instead of suffering with violence or retribution or name-calling or dehumanizing each other. Of course, following Jesus causes suffering. There is even suffering as we move to this table. There's suffering even here. This is not the place in our lives where we avoid suffering. At the first banquet that Jesus invited his followers to, there were people there who didn't get along. Simon was a zealot. That means he was a part of a religious political faction that believed it was their God-given duty to violently overthrow the Roman government. Matthew was a tax collector for the Roman government. They probably hated parts of each other. And Jesus did not say to Simon the Zealot, you will no longer be Simon the Zealot. And he did not say to Matthew the tax collector, you will no longer be a tax collector. He said, follow me. And in the trail of Jesus, the followers of Jesus must lose parts of themselves to be there. They must drop important identity markers that they have spent time developing. It hurts to say no to who you once were. It hurts to be a disciple of Jesus. It is scary to turn your back on your family of origin who taught you the ways to be successful in the world and to say, no, that's not quite where Jesus is leading me. To sit at the table where Jesus is the host means that we choose to suffer for each other, with each other, towards each other. And again, of course, that message has been here all along. For Jesus says, when you come and you eat, this is my body broken for you. And then Jesus says, when you come to this table, remember me, this wine is my blood spilled for you. Suffering has been a part of this meal from the very beginning. So church, this sacrament that we're part of, this sacred mystery that Jesus is inviting us to, it's an opportunity for us to choose to suffer for the right things, which is each other. To move towards each other in love, to refuse the dehumanizing of each other as the political season ramps up. To see each other not first and foremost as different racially, politically, ethnically, but first and foremost as sons and daughters of the God Most High. And Jesus as our King. That will take suffering. But at this meal, we are revealed. There is an apocalypse, and the household of God is judged first. And here, we are suffering with Jesus in glory. Church, this is the body of Jesus Christ, broken for us. Take and eat. Brothers and sisters of Jesus, Son of the Most High God, this is the blood of Jesus poured out for us and the healing of all the world. Take and drink. Church, would you stand and receive this blessing? May the peace of our Lord Jesus Christ go with you this week wherever he may send you. May he guide you in the wilderness. May he protect you in the storm. May he bring you home rejoicing at all the wonders he has shown you. May he bring you home rejoicing once again to these doors.